So today I want to go into more depth with the introduction sections of articles. And as you already know, introductions use the novelty moves a lot. But as you've seen from looking at different examples of articles, there can be several sections that fall under the rubric of an introduction. These sections might go by names such as literature review, which is the umbrella term that we use. Maybe there'll be a section called background, related work, relevant research, review of research. All of these we would call literature review, where the writer is going into a lot of depth about prior research. And the literature review really is an expanded version of the novelty moves that focuses on a detailed status quo and gap. And of course, there are several lexical bundles that go with the literature review as writers try to articulate agreements and disagreements with other research in the field. There's also a fair amount of evaluation language in a literature review or background or related work section, where they critique some of this other research because they have to do that in order to show that there's a gap. Now, the most common problems with literature reviews are that they're just kind of a stack of study, a data dump. So this right here is some actual quotes by dissertation advisors describing the literature reviews of their various students. So one advisor complains that a student's literature review is little more than a list of papers, or is just a chronological account, or is a kind of anthology, piece by piece. And instead of thinking of a literature review as an anthology where we stack a bunch of studies on top of each other, what we want to think about a literature review is as a puzzle, as various pieces that fit together. And so we articulate multiple status quos and multiple gaps, slowly narrowing down the focus and spending more time on the research that's more directly relevant to the writer's project to really articulate a lengthy, detailed gap that this current study is going to fill. So I want to start off by taking a look at a good literature review. And if you access the handout that accompanies this video, and I apologize, things are not quite in order, I'd like you to go to the password usability study. So I apologize, these aren't quite in order. We want to go down here to measuring password guessability. I think some of you have already seen this article. This is an annotated version of it. First of all, this is a good abstract that follows the novelty moves. And the introduction section, if you just take a look at it, is 4 paragraphs long. The first paragraph does a really good job showing the significance. The next paragraph, the status quo and gap. And then this paragraph right here showing how they fill the gap. It's unusual to have the methods and results in the introduction to this extent, but in this case they have done that and made a really clear discussion of their contribution. Now here's the related work section, and this is what I want to focus on. So as you can see, they've divided this into different sections. Section 2.1, so they're discussing all the work that goes with password corpora. In section 2.2, all the work that's dealt with password cracking. And there's a section 2.3, I think 2.4 as well. Now, in each of these, they move back and forth between the status quo and gap and slowly move towards filling the gap. In each one of these sections, they start out broad and then narrow down to a specific area. So we start out Due to the sensitive nature of passwords, acquiring high-quality password corpora can be difficult. And then they list the problems with them. Then we go into talking about specific studies. In the very first sentence here, we're grouping multiple studies together. So lots of studies that are grouped together, making a very general claim. They explain the corpora, and then they go into a lot of detail about the gap, that the problems with looking at passwords that have been collected from security leaks. So then they go to another status quo. Some researchers have controlled the circumstances by doing lab studies, and then they cite a smaller number of lab studies here. Others have used online studies, but the problem with that is that they've used low-value accounts. And then they say still others have asked students to create passwords for accounts tied to a class. Then they gesture towards filling their gap, that this study is going to do something different. Then in the next paragraph, they again group a large number of studies. Rather than collect passwords expressly for an experiment, some researchers have asked users to self-report password information. And this is a group of studies. Then they say the problems with this method of collection. Then, finally, a small number of researchers have been able to work with large organizations to collect authentic data. Florencio and Hurley used this technique. Bomio used this technique. Now, this is the first point where they're actually citing researchers by name. And this is the first time I think that they have referenced a single study at a time. And I know at this point that we're getting closer to their actual gap, the actual gap that they're going to fill, and they're going to talk about their study soon, because they're spending more time on individual studies. Then they say the gap with these two studies here, that they've used large reliable samples, but they were able to record only extremely limited information about the context. Then they suggest how their study would address that. And then we move here, perhaps closest to our work. So if I didn't already know by the amount of space that was dedicated to each one of these, I would know from this phrase, perhaps closest to our work. Fall et al. Use within subject studies. And they found that while study passwords have some problems, they can provide a reasonable approximation. So this is the longest we've spent talking about any one study. And so I know that they are getting much closer to their actual research here. So imagine, as an analogy, that our class meets in Porter Hall. Let's say I am taking you with me to a meeting that we are going to, and you don't know what building it is. So we go out Porter Hall, we walk past Ween, past Doherty, and I'm still moving pretty quickly. And you're like, okay, it must not be in these buildings because she's moving quickly. And then we get down and we get to the fine arts area. And I'm still moving kind of quickly. You're like, okay, that must not be it. And then we move to Warner Hall, and I start slowing down as if I'm looking for the entranceway. And you're like, the meeting must be in this building because she slowed down. Similarly, in a literature review, at the beginning of the literature review, when we're far away from where we're trying to go, we move quickly. We cover a lot of ground at once, discuss multiple studies at once. And then, as we get closer and closer to our destination, to our endpoint, the researcher slows down, spends more detail, is looking for the specific gap, the specific point of entry that they are going to use to make their contribution, to show how their research is extending prior knowledge. So we see the slow down a lot here. So based on this criteria, this model, I'd like you to move up to the first two studies from a related work on a paper also in computer science. Go ahead and pause your video and figure out which version is stronger, version A or version B, and see if you can articulate why. So hopefully you saw that version A was the stronger of the two versions. Let's walk through this. So version A moves us through the novelty moves a little bit more clearly and really leads up to the current research study. So the first sentence here characterizes a group of studies. It doesn't just jump in to an individual study, doesn't get into the details too thickly. So prior research comparing search patterns has found searches are more constrained on mobile devices than PCs. Then the first study is characterized as an example of that. The second study is another example. And we end here by grouping these studies together. These studies indicate that there are unique patterns on different devices. Then they move to only one study. So this is an example of the writer slowing down. Only one study that we know of has examined cross-device searching within users. This sentence, if I didn't already know it by this point in the article, would tell me, hey, their research project has something to do with cross-device searching within users. Then they focus on Wang and discuss Wang study for several sentences. So this is the prior research, the status quo, and again, because they're spending several sentences on this, I know that we're close to their endpoint. Then the writers say, however, Wang only looked at one particular type of search across two devices. This study extends Wang to account for other types of searches. Now, by contrast, the weaker example here takes a look at, now they do group several studies, but all they do is say, I'm going to look at 3 studies that are relevant. So it doesn't really do, because it would be really weird to include studies that weren't relevant. So this doesn't really provide me much information other than now I know that there are going to be 3 studies. And they just kind of stack these studies up. Kamvar and Beluha do this. Kamvar et al. Presented this. And while there's some discussion of the findings, there's not that connecting language to tell us how these studies build upon one another. Whereas example A had more of those transition words, similarly, like such and such. And Lee studied these things, and Song studied these things. So there's not much, these are just kind of stacked on top of each other. There's not much sense of coherence. There's not much sense of telling a story, of leading me somewhere. It just seems like we're just kind of stacking these above one another. Then they focus on Wang for a full paragraph, but we don't really know where they're going. And of course, there's no gap and fill the gap move on here. Now let's look at another paired sample in this handout. Go ahead and take a look at Literature Review A on positive tutor feedback and Literature Review B. This is from a student in actually the first semester that the GCC, and I taught this class, trained the tutors. One of these is from her first draft, and one of these is from her revised draft. Go ahead and take a look and see if you can recognize in this more humanities educational context, which one would make the stronger literature review. Now, both of these versions move us towards a gap and how she's filling the gap. But I hope that you saw that version B is the stronger version. By contrast, version A is her original draft, And pretty much each paragraph is dedicated to a single study, and the beginning of each paragraph focuses on, it has a summary statement. So and so found this, so and so conducted this study. Some of these have a little bit more characterization, but for the most part, it's fairly reporting the studies and not really grouping and characterizing studies in a way that moves us towards the gap. Version B, while there's still room for improvement. So I've plugged my computer in. I hope I didn't frighten you with that. So version B, as I was saying, is that there's room for improvement, but it's much better than version A. So we begin each section with something each paragraph with something that characterizes the paragraph. And then we go into specific studies, and there are multiple studies per paragraph. Second paragraph, studies also show that praising students for intelligence is less helpful than for effort. And so then we have citations. And so we're moving towards the researcher's gap, the writer's gap. Now, she doesn't do quite as good a job as the other two models that we saw of slowing us down, but still, this is a much better version of characterizing multiple studies at once, as opposed to just stacking them on top of one another. Now what I'd like you to do is scroll down to the very last one. I decided example C in here I don't like anymore. Doesn't work as well as I'd like. For class, I'd like you to take a look at example D and talk about what questions would you ask this writer? How would you work with them to improve this literature review, this review of prior work on utility scale electricity storage?